Hi, welcome, and happy Earth Day. I am Whitney Dorer. I am the Deputy Director at Friends of Trees. I use she, her pronouns, and I am here with a very special guest today to celebrate Earth Day, Dr. Vivek Shandas.
Hello, I'm Vivek Shandas, Professor of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University, and I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm delighted to wish you a happy Earth Day, and who else to spend this day with than folks who curate and hold our urban trees together. Thank you.
We are in an absolutely gorgeous spot. I actually have never been here before. We are at Southeast 102nd and Powell at Portland's Memory Garden. It's a beautiful space that's really accessible and has some wonderful plantings in addition to some older trees. And I also wanted to mention that Vivek and I are both fully vaccinated, which is why we are not wearing our masks and outside. We are celebrating this moment together, and really it's a beautiful day here in Portland, Oregon. It's cooled off. The past couple of days have been extremely hot. And I am relieved for our plants and trees that it's a little bit cooler. So I wanted to start by asking you, do you have a personal memory or connection to trees and green spaces?
Oh my goodness, where do I begin? So many memories. I feel really fortunate to have had a couple of parents when I was growing up really encouraging me to look at nature in very great detail. So it was like the little bugs and the little grasses to then getting bigger and bigger to where I would spend a lot of time as this mango tree that was right next to our house in South India that I would love to climb and love to play on and of course eat the fruits from. And so it started for me very early on trying to get a real deep and profound and really fulfilling connection to trees just starting off my life. And that started from the smallest things to the largest grand things, many of which are around us today.
So you are doing some really interesting work around urban tree canopy. And today we are talking about equitably growing the urban tree canopy. And I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing, like, what does that mean, equitably growing our urban tree canopy?
Yeah, it's a really important question, in part because what we're finding is that these wonderful trees, our green leafy friends, have a lot more presence in some neighborhoods than others. And we started scratching our heads and asking ourselves, like, why are we seeing this as a constant pattern around the country, whether it's Portland, whether it's Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whether it's Dallas, Texas, or New York City? We're finding that certain areas of cities, especially those that are wealthier, often demographically a whiter population, tend to have more trees in their backyards, in their street tree plantings, as well as a lot more parks. And so we were wondering, why is it that that's happening? And that started a whole question about equity, and is this equitably distributed across the city? Because trees, as we all well know, give us lots of really, really important things like clean air to breathe, the shade that we get from trees, a lot of birds, a lot of squirrels, a lot of the habitat that trees provide. And so these are things that are really helpful to human health and well-being. And so if a community doesn't have a lot of trees, we got to ask ourselves, like, are they just getting hit harder when it's hotter out, when the air pollution is worse? Are these the communities that actually end up suffering the hardest as a result of not having that rich, verdant canopy around them? And so then it becomes an equity question of what is it we can do to start supporting the expansion of the tree canopy and supporting communities that have not historically had tree canopy. Does that resonate?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm curious about the solutions that you're thinking of, and with your team at PSU, what kinds of solutions have you been starting to see, like nationally and locally, towards equitably growing the urban tree canopy?
Yeah, well, we're finding that it takes about 3 steps to really do this. The first is to recognize it, is to actually understand that there is this difference in the amount of trees and the types of trees and the extensiveness of trees in some parts of the city versus others. And so Portland has been really trying to lead on this effort of being able to describe which neighborhoods, in fact, which streets have more trees and which ones have fewer trees. So that's the first step we start getting into. soon after that, we start getting into questions around what are the places that are having least trees and also might not have the resources to be able to take care of trees should trees get planted there. And so we start thinking about what are ways, if we do bring trees into a neighborhood, what are ways to work with that community to be able to co-manage and co-create that space in such a way that those trees will be well taken care of. And the third step, of course, is getting to action and starting to actually use that kind of collaborative process like Friends of Trees regularly does, to be able to then allow a community to really own those trees and own that space and become a lot more of an active participant in the stewardship and caring for those new green friends that show up in their neighborhood.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I wanted to welcome everybody again. We're here at Portland's Memory Garden, a really cool site if you haven't checked it out in Southeast Portland. I'm Whitney Dorer, and this is
Vivek Shandas.
And we are here just talking about equitably growing our urban tree canopy, and not just growing, but caring for. You know, you mentioned something that really affected our community this year, which was a huge ice storm. And we saw trees down and branches down across the city. And I'm curious if you've had any thoughts or, you know, tree care, like how do we equitably manage our urban forest?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because as we are aiming to grow the urban forest, meaning we're not only watching the trees grow themselves, but expand the number and distribution of the trees, we want to start asking, like, how are these things going to be cared for? And if they're cared for as they are in forests, like wild forests, that means big ice storms come in or heat waves come in, and the weaker ones fall apart or die. And what we saw with this ice storm just earlier this year in 2021, we started seeing a lot of limbs failing and a lot of trees actually coming down, entire specimen falling down. And so part of what I started, and a group of us started asking, is were there any patterns to the limbs breaking and the trees falling? And we were finding that those places that often had less care for the trees, they weren't regularly maintained, they weren't pruned, they weren't actually ensured that there was sufficient soil volume for the trees. Those are the places where trees had lots of issues and where a lot of infrastructure damage was created. And so what we want to do is really think about that long game. Like, how do we get a tree in, and what do we do to ensure its care? Mm-hmm. And just to remind us all that in the city of Portland, if you're living next to a tree and the side between your house and the street is a tree, that's your responsibility as a property owner. If you're a renter, then it's the property owner's responsibility. Nevertheless, that's a very expensive bill. And there's some communities who can't pay $500, $700 for a professional to come in and prune those trees and make it kind of safe for those ice storms. Or what we're seeing even more frequently now is during the hot summer days, trees will just shed a branch because they're reaching a point where it's very vulnerable and it's very difficult for them from their evolutionary history to actually keep all the branches, because they just don't have enough water in the ground, and that heat is drying up the soils, which allows that water to really be challenged within the stem of the tree. And so we start seeing a lot of that breakage happening, not in the winter, but in this case in the summer. So that care and knowing about the tree and getting support to do it is really, really essential.
Yeah, Friends of Trees has actually maybe 8 or 9 years ago started a community tree care program, and really increased the amount of young tree pruning that we're doing with volunteers. And now we have dozens of trained pruning leaders who are pruning city street trees, or trees that are within the right of way, many of which Friends of Trees planted, but some that the resident plants. And they are just so appreciative of having that support at the tree's young age to provide structure and health and care reminders. And then of course we encourage them to find a trained arborist to do future care. I feel like that's the direction we're going, is really needing to focus on tree care, focus on that young tree pruning and maintenance to help these trees thrive in the changing climate.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something that's coming up over and over. I couldn't agree with you more. I'm so delighted to hear Friends of Trees doing that kind of work, because in part, that's what it's going to take. It's going to take organizations like Friends of Trees and other groups to be able to really support communities in doing this hard work, because it's just not, well, what we're noticing is it's just not happening on its own. And with the city is got limited staff and limited resource to be able to find all of the millions of trees that are in the area or in the city.
So I'm going to welcome everybody again. I'm Whitney Dorer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm with Friends of Trees, and this is
Vivek Shandas.
And we are at Portland's Memory Garden talking about trees and equitably growing our urban forests to celebrate Earth Day today. And we are also both vaccinated, so we're without our masks, enjoying the fresh air in this beautiful site. I encourage you to come check it out. I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit more towards something that I've been really fascinated in your work around heat and the impacts of heat and how your team has come to analyze heat and where that plays into urban forest and trees.
Sure. So there's almost a reciprocal relationship between trees and heat, right? Where you see trees, you see cooler temperatures, and where you see hotter temperatures, you often don't find trees. And so what we're really trying to do is go out and work with community groups to go and understand what the distribution of heat is like in their neighborhood, on their street, and in the city or the region as a whole. And by collecting very hyper-local data on temperature, we're able to start saying, what are the things locally, meaning, is it the road, is it the lawn, is it the buildings, is it the trees that is helping to either keep this area cool or amplify temperatures and make it really unbearable and sometimes even fatal for some communities. And so what we've done is really try to first describe where the heat is in and around a city. Then after that, we start getting into what can we do about it? And that's what immediately people ask. They see a map of temperature and they're like, I live right there. Wow, it looks a lot hotter. It's a lot redder on our maps than the other blue parts that are cooler. What can I do about that? And so we start having conversations about the different ways we can use what we call nature-based solutions, which are often greening and trees, to be able to cool those areas and find not only that they cool the areas, but also bring all these other co-benefits, as we call them. Things like cleaner air, things like birds that you get to see, things like when the rain falls heavily, the water soaks into the ground, and that's a really important thing to reduce flooding in and around a neighborhood. So when we start talking about solutions, we immediately start thinking about what's the role of trees in cooling the neighborhood, and then of course what we were just talking about, how do you find ways to care for those trees so that they don't get stressed out in the heat? Because just like us, anything living, when temperatures go up, we're not evolved to those temperatures, we start seeing some real challenges in the physiology of our bodies or within the trees. And so how do you get enough water to the trees to be able to keep them healthy throughout the hot summers?
Yeah, with heat, I often think also about corridors and areas that are just so much pavement and car traffic. And then the risk of pedestrians and those using spaces that are surrounding those areas of high traffic and extreme heat. And the challenge that Friends of Trees and others face in trying to find those green solutions in really challenging cityscapes, where everything has been cemented, and how are we going to make the space for trees? So I'm curious if you've had or seen in your work like any solutions for areas like that, where we are needing to look beyond the space that's open now, and how do we kind of move to the next step for planting trees in new places?
Right. So that's one of the most interesting questions coming up with the actual planting of trees and planting of trees these days. And one of the most immediate things that somebody can start to do is try to understand right in your own neighborhood how much of the neighborhood is open space for being able to plant trees and how much of it is sealed up by concrete or asphalt, whether it be sidewalks or driveways or roads that prevent trees from being able to get into the ground. And what we've done is created this interesting kind of, way to think about this by characterizing a place as a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 place. And let me just get into that just for a bit here. Tier 1 is where you have a neighborhood like this particular park, for example, where it's a lot of exposed space, and you can just drop a tree in really easily. You go to any spot, you can say, oh wow, if there's available sunlight, there's some space, you can get a tree, it'll grow reasonably well there. That's kind of a easy, low-hanging fruit. And the tricky part is that what we were talking about earlier, the communities that had a lot of disinvestment, meaning not a lot of money or resources put into it back almost 100 years ago, we're finding that those communities have a lot more concrete and asphalt and pavement than the neighborhoods that had a lot of investment in those areas where you find tier 1 spots all over the place. So what we're trying to do is say, okay, how do you center historically disinvested communities and neighborhoods in your tree planting efforts? And I just put a side note, it's delightful to be in an evaluation project with Friends of Trees to understand how that kind of planting process is working. And how do you get into those tier 2 and tier 3, which tier 2 are, you have to do some site modification, like you have to do a 4x6 cut tree well or something like that, where you can get soil volume, get a tree into the ground. And there would be tier 2 streets, tier 2 neighborhoods all around a city. And identifying those and recognizing that that's going to take a little additional effort. And then the tier 3 are the bigger lifts, if you will, the bold moves where if a road is being re-engineered, then traffic designers are thinking about different ways to configure the road, like Portland is doing right now with the 2035 Streets 2035 project that's happening through the Portland Bureau of Transportation. That's an opportunity to think about what are the ways you can bring trees and green infrastructure into areas that are undergoing change. So that allows us to immediately start thinking with the engineers, the traffic engineers, the environmental scientists, the other planners that are involved in the process, like, could we do a bump out, a sidewalk bump out, or a curb bump out? Could we do a stormwater swale? Can we re-engineer this place to allow for a greater number of green spaces in this space? Because we know with more traffic will come more pollution, we know will come more heat, and so what are the things that can help mitigate a lot of those are really weaving in some green spaces into those locations. So that's at least one way we've started thinking about that.
Yeah, and those solutions do take time. I was recently working on a project at Astor Elementary up in North Portland. It's a massive playground that is just asphalt, and they removed 10,000 square feet through support with DPAVE and another grant, but it took 3 years to get that in the workings. And now there's 20 new trees planted in that space. So it takes time and dedication, and I feel like what you're sharing about connecting, like as an individual, what can you do? I think becoming aware of your surroundings and really starting to question, like ask questions of yourself. Who owns this land? How can we redefine it? How can we find space for trees within our urban forest? I think about also the solutions like trees on buildings, eco roofs, like what do you see in your research about those? Are they making a difference? Is it a kind of a path that we should continue to explore?
Yeah, the work happening on three-dimensional green infrastructure, if you will, like putting green walls up, trees on roofs, I think is a whole new agenda for architects, and it's a whole new agenda for kind of urbanists and people who study cities, and it's a whole new agenda for ecologists, in part because we've never put a tree up at 30 feet, 40 feet, 30 stories, 40 stories up in the air. And generally speaking, I think there's a lot of value to that, in part because not only are there the more functional things about clean air and temperature, there's a lot of cultural things that might affect our mental health and well-being. And if an apartment building has, for example, no open spaces because the apartment is edge to edge in terms of that parcel or that lot, then what options do the community members have? They can walk, if they can, to local parks, though if they have a garden somewhere in the building or on the building, it allows for a lot more easy access to a place that's verdant like this for people to really get some real measurable mental health benefits from from those spaces. And so in large part, I think this is just opening it's just opening a whole research agenda. It's just opening a whole opportunity for us to understand how these things are going to work, because right now they're very piecemeal, and it's usually done often with a lot of kind of flamboyance and kind of flair. And what I want to see is this being more systematically implemented, and that allows us to study how well it's working, what are the benefits, what are the challenges, and giving us a little bit more of the science to be able to start making the decisions and supporting decision makers as they think about whether to approve more trees on top of buildings, or what kinds of trees, or how big can they be, how little do they need to be, etc. So we're just starting that conversation.
And I love that you touched on the mental health benefits of trees. I think that's something that we continue to hear at Friends of Trees, especially during COVID, is the appreciation of our community and volunteers in being able to come out and safely participate in green space. Feeling connected to the land has really helped people get through. And I find so much value in coming to a place like this. You know, here we are in Portland Memory Garden. I'm gonna plug it again because it's such a cool spot. It's an accessible park that is so beautiful, and I feel like my stress level has decreased in the last 15 minutes that myself and Vivek have been chatting about trees.
Yeah.
And I guess I would love to ask just one last question about, you know, where do you see your research going in the future? What are you seeing interest from both your students as well as the nation and the community here about what are we looking to next?
I'm getting more, I've been so deep into the data science side of trees and trying to understand that, and that's probably going to continue, though in the last few years, and especially in the last year, given the pandemic, given a lot of the racial violence that's emerged, and the kinds of race-based violence that's emerged, and the kinds of questions of what is the role of green spaces in this context of a very polarized society, community, I'm getting a lot more interested in the cultural and social dimensions of trees. And what I'm hearing from a lot of communities is that we want to start thinking about the way in which parks, for example, I love going to parks, but I remember back in the day, my own personal experience of going to parks in places where a person of color, as I identify as, was not really welcome. And these kinds of like subtle kind of access and privilege notions of green space is something that I'm getting really personally interested in, and I'm trying to think about ways to kind of leverage my own personal experience with that, with my experience with outdoor spaces and parks and the like, whether urban or otherwise, to research agendas and to ways to think about this in a kind of a multicultural context, in a multiracial context, in an anti-racist context. And how do we actually allow green spaces to be that open space for conversation, for greater integration and understanding of communities that have maybe been really polarized. And I think green spaces is the ideal avenue to be able to bring those polarized voices together in a safe and comfortable space to be able to have those hard conversations. So that's where I think most of my work is going to go, if I have the privilege to get into that.
I hope you do, and I have to say I feel so honored to get to walk around with you today.
Likewise.
And chat, and also to partner with PSU and just you in the world of trees. I see great places that our future will go, and I'm excited to see what more you have to share. I feel like we have a part 2 and 3 and 4 coming up with you. And I'm just so appreciative of you spending Earth Day with us and Friends of Trees. We've been having a whole day of virtual events, and there's more coming up, so I hope you check it out. And yeah, please go hug a tree for us. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yay, thanks Whitney. This has been such a lovely conversation, lots to think about for sure, and I'm so grateful to know you and all the work that Friends of Trees does for this city and many other places, for making our city so habitable. Thank you.
Thanks so much.